Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, and I'm here today with Ben Yagoda, Professor Emeritus at the University of Delaware and author of this fabulous new book, Gobsmacked! The British Invasion of American English. Ben, welcome to the Grammar Girl podcast.
Thank you so much. It is an honor and pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's a delight to have you here. These fabulous words. One thing I was wondering is the British invasion of American English, but, doesn't American English kind of start from British English? Like, what makes a word worthy of inclusion in this book?
Yeah, I mean, go, flashback 250, 300 years, there were the colonies and there was Britain, and the language was pretty much the same vocabulary, same grammar, and so forth. But over the years, they've diverged a little bit. Um, the famous quote is that there are two countries separated by a common language. And, every each side had slang, words for new technology that came up, just new words. That words pop up, and they wouldn't really pop up across the ocean at the same time. They would tend to pop up there or here. And then there began to be a little bit of cross pollination, maybe 100 years or so after the revolution, late 1800s, when things had kind of settled in the American language and the British language. And in fact, and one reason why British people are gobsmacked or amused by this book is that the narrative has been that it's been more the other way, that Americanisms have come to affect, or sometimes described as pollute, British English. And they've been upset about that for quite some time. The example that somehow, two examples always seem to come up. You guys, they are, not very happy about that. And when you order food saying, "Can I get a coffee?" That's considered an Americanism. Oh, yeah. And then the other one is awesome. They don't like people coming over and say, "This is awesome. That's awesome." Um, and then they complain that people call chips fries, which they call them chips, we call them fries. And they call them biscuits, we call them cookies. And they feel that cookies and fries have come over and infected their pure language. So the fact that it has also gone the other way, that British terms have become popular in American English for over 100 years, but I believe much more rapidly and more frequently in the last, say, 25, 30 years, is really surprising to them.
Have you spent a lot of time in England? Like, what made you embark on this journey?
I have. You mentioned my teaching career at the University of Delaware, and I was lucky enough to, on I think it was 5 occasions, teach a study abroad class in London, either for a 5-week winter session or summer session. So, that adds up to 6, 7, 8 months over there. And one of the classes I taught, actually, was a professor of journalism, was on the British press. So I was
Mm.
reading the British press a lot and became aware of just how many different words and terms they have there. When you're an American and you're watching, British comedies about British people, there's just a few words they say, like telly and the tube and a lift for elevator, but there's really more. There's hundreds and hundreds of different terms that they use. So I started noticing that. And then 5, 6 years after I started doing this in the mid 90s, 5, 6 years later, I started noticing the terms I had encountered in British journalism coming over and appearing here. And first there was one, then two or three or four, then a dozen, then more, and it became a trend. And
Yeah, and this started on your long-running blog, right?
yeah, so I started a blog about this phenomenon called Not One-Off Britishisms, and one-off is one of them. A one-off is an expression that means a one-time only, one-time only occurrence. And that was one of the ones that I noticed in the British press. This election was a one-off, or the game was a one-off. It started popping up in the New York Times and the things I'd read here. So the blog started in 2011, still going strong. I've done, don't know exactly how many, but I'm sure over 1,000 entries. Have had, weirdly, for such a narrow topic, over 3 million page views, which for you, that's small change, but for like this weird topic about British expressions in America, it's kind of amazing. And then a couple of years ago, I decided I would try to adapt it into a book, and that's what's about to come out.
It's great, and we're gonna get to the words in a sec, but it just occurred to me, yeah, you mentioned the New York Times. You talk a lot in the book about the New York Times. Do you feel like that is kind of a conduit for the British words that come into American English, or is it just a coincidence that's what you read a lot?
Yeah, it is. It's a coincidence. It's a conduit. I'm trying to think of another CON word. It's also, New York Times is great because they've got NewYorkTimes.com, and it's very easy to search for any word or phrase back to the first edition in 1851. So you can
Mm.
chart these things over time. So that's very convenient. I use a lot of other resources as well, different Google databases and corpora from, actually, by you in Utah. They've put together just an amazing collection of these things. So in this day and age, you can chart these things historically and see when a word popped up and see how popular it's become. But the Times also, it's like, I don't know. It's the biggest, the best, the most read American news source. So if it's not in the Times as a Britishism, it hasn't happened yet. It's a very convenient. Is that another? Yeah,
Yeah,
coincidence,
so
conduit,
convenient.
convenient. It's a very convenient source for me to look. And I try not to rely too much on it because it's only one source, but it's probably the most useful way of looking at whether a word has penetrated into American consciousness.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we have to start with the cover word, gobsmacked. Do you wanna talk about that one?
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of these words, when I talk to people about the concept of this, it's sometimes a little hard to grasp because it is so kind of narrow and complicated. But I give some examples, like go missing and gobsmacked. And among Americans, especially young Americans, they find it hard to believe that that word hasn't always been around in America, and it hasn't. I mean, you're not old, but you remember a time when people didn't say gobsmacked.
I
Um,
do, yeah.
yeah,
It
now
seems
they do.
newish.
Um, the definition is flabbergasted, astounded, speechless, or incoherent with amazement. And it's a Yorkshire word. I mean, probably the greatest resource is the Oxford English Dictionary, which is online, and it has this historical uh, bent. So when you look for a word, it shows you the earliest use they have found in their team of people around the world sending in examples. So yeah, they report that this word is from Yorkshire, and there's a great quote of a politician from that region of Britain, Roy Hattersley, in 1980, um, who wrote a sentence. It was his dazzling display of simultaneous social and intellectual sophistication that left me in the patois of the place whence I came, quote, gobsmacked. And that's brilliant, to use another Britishism for me, because the quotes around the word gobsmacked indicates that it's still rather unfamiliar. So people put
Mm.
it in quotation marks. He also identifies it, that it's whence he came. So it's just a perfect quote. And that was 1980. So it already, but even then wasn't that familiar, even in Britain. But quickly it became so. New York Times used it 46 times in 2021 and 2022. So probably these words, that they when they first get adopted over here, they're sort of new and shiny and sound different and clever. The danger is they become cliches, which probably Gobsmacked has become. And now I realize it's the title of my book. So Too late to change now.
I think it works. It does. Well, you've been dropping the Britishisms. There's so I'm marking like I want to talk about this one. I want to talk about that one. Gone missing. You mentioned.
Yeah.
So many years ago, probably I don't know, 15 years ago or so, when I still did this kind of thing, it was the grammar girl pet peeve of the year
Mm.
because so many people had complained to me about the phrase "gone missing." Do you want to talk? And so now I know we can blame the British.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's probably exhibit one that young people don't believe it wasn't always an Americanism. Um, and using these tools in corpora and databases, you can sort of chart the use. And before around 2000, it was very, very rarely used in the US. Interestingly, it's actually fairly new in Britain. It's kind of a late 20th century term. Like I was saying, these things just pop up. And I believe it started in Australia. And so
Hmm.
you can talk about a person who went missing, an object, you know, could be a battleship, it could be your wallet. And it's very useful. What we had, and a lot of times these terms become popular, not just because they're new and shiny, because they serve a need. So what
Hmm.
we had before was it vanished, it disappeared. It sounds like a magician, describing their act. It's gone missing is better, I would say, and it really caught on. And it, it, this was one that I kind of was able to tie to a particular event. Um, 2001, this congressional intern Chandra Levy disappeared, and it was a big, big news story, kind of thrown off the front pages by the 9/11 attacks. And my hypothesis is that the reporters were talking about it so much that they were grasping around for a nickname. Excuse me, not a nickname. They were grasping around for a synonym, just not to
Hmm.
be have to say vanished and disappeared so many times. And go missing started to pop up then. I later got an email from the reporter on the first time I was able to find it used about Chandra Levy. I'm not sure it was the first. And she said, essentially, she was gobsmacked to see that on my blog because she grew up in Britain and thought it was normal, was writing for American. So that might have been the typhoid Mary that got go missing into American parlance.
Amazing. Yeah, it is pretty unusual to be able to trace it back to one thing like that, but that was a huge story at the time.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Another one, and you had sent me a list of some of the terms that you wanted to talk about. Smog. That was one that was traceable.
I would have thought that was American.
Right. And it's certainly was used much more in the US, but it was literally invented in Britain in 1905. And again, using the databases and resources, Google Books and the Times of London Index and these University of Utah corpora. um, there was a newspaper, the Globe, that reported in 1905. The other day, at a meeting of the Public Health Congress, Dr. Deveux did a public service in coining a new word for the London fog, which is referred to as, quote, smog, a compound of smoke and fog. So there you have it in black and white.
Hmm.
And it's really fun to be able to come across a nugget like that that shows the exact moment when a word that we feel is common was coined.
Yeah, that is great, and I guess in retrospect, it shouldn't surprise me that it came up in London. I was in London in the, mid-80s, and I'm not making this up, I sneezed, like, every 3 minutes from the air pollution. I was walking around with a Kleenex box, it was awful, and then when we went to the countryside, I was fine, so it was clearly the air pollution, and then I went back more recently, and they've cleaned it all
It
up, it's
is,
great, I love
yeah.
London.
Like Pittsburgh, was famously associated with smog. LA, I think it's gotten marginally better in all those places.
Yeah, yeah. Well, another word you mentioned was awfully, awful, awful, how the Britons don't like, awesome, that was it, the
Yeah,
Britons don't like awesome
awesome.
coming from America, but in your book, you say awfully comes from Britain, saying that's awfully nice or something like that.
Yes, and Yeah, that's the one I put forth as the very first not one off Britishisms, and the there was a guy, an American guy, Richard Grant White, who coined the term. He called it Britishisms. I prefer Britishisms, complaining in 1868 about British words that had infected. That's the language is often used, the American language, and the, he complained about using awfully to mean very, like it was awfully nice of you, um, that offended him for some reason. I don't see the
Well,
objection.
I still hear people complain about it
Really?
sometimes. They tend to be much older people, but they will say that, awfully should be referred to for awe. Awesome and
Okay. Okay.
awfully, it should relate to awe,
Yeah, I mean
feeling
that's
of
really
awe,
old fashioned.
reverence.
It's a long time ago. Awful took on the meaning of bad or terrible. Um, and then this awfully meaning intensive or very was even after that. So you've got some old school people you're in touch with. Well, you're sort of you're the conduit of all complaints. You've heard them all probably.
It feels like it, but then new ones still pop up.
Sure,
I
sure.
can't
No,
think
of
of
course
any.
they're new
Yeah.
ones. Yeah. Interesting.
I do hear a lot. Another one that I absolutely would have thought it was new and American is brunch.
Yep.
Brunch feels very new to
Yeah.
me, but you
Um,
said it's not.
It is not, and, that's one of those words that it's an unusual word, so you can just plug it in and search it and spits out, these various search engines. It's how I basically spend or waste my time is searching for these words, keeps me off the streets, but yeah, it was university slang originally in 1895. The Independent reported, "Breakfast is brekker in the Oxford tongue, and when a man makes lunch his first meal of the day, it becomes brunch." And it caught on, and it took a while. These words that are successful on the one country, uh, the more successful they are, they generally cross the ocean eventually, and brunch took about 30 or 40 years. So 1930s, 1940s, that was when brunch in America started to become commonly used. And I've got a category in the book. I try for every word I indicate whether it's on the radar or emerging or fully adopted or outpaced, that it's actually used more in the U.S. than Britain. And I think brunch is one of those words that at this point is
Mhm,
used more here.
and it's so useful,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
useful. Yeah. I went through a period where I would miss lunch and then have a big meal, like, around 3 and then skip dinner, and we started talking about dinner, and that's really useful too, but there's we don't have it hasn't caught
You know,
on like
it
brunch.
doesn't have that hard consonant at the start. Yeah. I'm amazed that whenever I hear that people skip a meal, I've never skipped a meal in my life. So I salute you. Good on you, as they say in
Well,
Australia.
you put me in front of a spreadsheet or something, and I'll forget to eat.
That is, yeah, my powers of concentration are not on that level. So,
That's brilliant. So, a brilliant is, one of the words,
yeah,
and I find myself wondering, I feel like brilliant started being used a lot more after Harry Potter became really popular.
yeah.
Did you in your research, have you found that Harry Potter was a big influence in words crossing over?
Well, I'm sure it was, and I did some forensic research, um, comparing the British editions to the American editions, and actually, a very high percentage of the Britishisms were changed. So, one of the words, and I see it's on your list as well, is ginger, referring
Mhm.
to a red-haired person. What we used to call a redhead is a ginger, and that's become quite common in the U.S. And I thought that it was because of Harry's friend, whose name escapes me,
Ron.
Ron Weasley, right? Yeah, who was a ginger-haired bloke, but in fact, um, as far as I could tell, even in the British edition, she doesn't use the word ginger about him. Um,
Hmm.
there's one pun where it's always red-haired, red-haired, and one pun where it's like a Tom Swifty where she said he did something gingerly as the adverb. So that was it was clever. But probably the more important influence for Ginger was Ginger Spice and the Spice Girls. She was
Of
one of the
course.
Spice Girls. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I don't recall looking into the extent to which "brilliant" was used in the Harry Potter books. I actually think I read a half of one. My kids were just at the age where they read them themselves, and so I didn't read them aloud to them. So I don't know whether "brilliant" was used, but that word certainly has it's come over, and it's a complicated one because people sometimes say, "Well, we've said brilliant all the time," and we have, but with different kind of nuances and different connotations. Um, in the U.S., we've for a long time talked about a brilliant star, bright, or a brilliant person, meaning very, very smart. But the Brits use it about kind of inanimate objects. That meal was brilliant. Okay, that's not something we would traditionally have said. It's a little bit on the radar edging over here. They also use it ironically. So somebody says something you don't
Mm.
quite agree with them, you say brilliant, and
Oh,
you could hear the dripping irony in their
I
voice.
didn't realize that.
Yeah,
Is it kinda like bless your heart?
it's very much like bless your heart. Brilliant, brilliant, or yeah, right. One of those somewhat sarcastic comebacks.
Oh, watch out for that now.
Yeah.
Is clever like that? Does clever have a
Yes.
different meaning in British and American
Does,
English?
it really does. So, and it relates to the word smart, okay? So, when we're talking about intelligent people, the word that Americans commonly use is smart. Um,
Mhm.
British in Britain, smart means stylish, like that's a smart outfit you're wearing or a smart furnishings. Um, for what we call smart kids, smart children, they use clever. So the clever
Hmm.
children are in the most advanced class. That is on the radar. It's kind of making its way over here. You don't hear it that much, but it pops up now and again.
Hmm. And, there's a couple of words that you highlighted that feel like when people use them, I feel like it sounds a little bit pretentious.
Hmm.
So bespoke is one of those.
Yeah,
Uh, I think I would just say custom
custom
but when I hear
made.
bespoke, it feels, I don't know, fancy.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of those words that has really reached the level of cliché. So in
Mm,
Britain from the 1800s, um, it was the word was used uh, strictly about clothing and often actually shoes. That was the place where it was most commonly used.
hmm,
And there was a movie that I saw when I was a kid called The Bespoke Overcoat that was made in the 50s. But, it started to just, become more popular and become a vogue word and a buzzword, and now you have bespoke investment planning, bespoke computer systems, bespoke, audio components, and it's just it's over the top, to use another Britishism. It's gotten a little bit too far. Um, Similar to a word that's not a Britishism that's also become a cliche and overused is curated, a curated experience. It's overdone.
mhm. What about on holiday? And it just occurred to me, I have a lot of British listeners, so I hope that, we love British English where when I said pretentious, that I didn't mean that
Oh
when
yeah,
Americans say
of
it
course. I
sounds
mean,
pretentious.
the British people aren't pretentious when they use it. That's their common word. It's the Americans, and yeah. So I think that would be one where I would legitimately call an American who says I'm on holiday pretentious, the P word, just because like some others, unlike Go Missing and Gobsmacked and some of these others that really uh, there's no substitute. On holiday is exactly equal to on vacation. And I mean, being pretentious isn't the worst thing. It's not like being mean to animals or anything like that. It's fine. But I would have to say that an American who says they're on holiday, as I've heard people say, is in fact a bit pretentious.
Yeah. And here's an interesting difference between British and American English is that we call the dot at the end of a sentence a period, and British people call it a full stop. So are people starting in the US to call it a full stop
They
too?
are, and you hear it frequently. That might sound a little more forceful. It's so that when people say this situation is terrible, full stop, or this situation is terrible, period, to emphasize the force with which they're saying. Uh, there are certain people, a lot of them are New York Times writers, but there are others as well who are really prone to Britishisms. One of them is actually the politician Newt Gingrich, who is
Hmm.
very, very fond of clever. He's talked about Mitt Romney once, said that wasn't very clever of him, was it? Which is a pure British way of saying things. But another one is our former president, not the guy who's running now, but Barack Obama.
Hmm.
He was fond of a number of Britishisms, full stop being one of them. That was a term he used a lot when he wanted to emphasize something. I have a chapter on faux Britishisms, um, certain words that people think are Britishisms but really aren't. And
Hmm.
Obama used one of those, uh, which is the words that spelled DivisIve. I think I spelled it right. And
Hmm.
how would you pronounce that?
I would say divisive.
That's I would say divisive. Americans and British people have always said divisive, but the pronunciation divisive started to pop up. Actually, I think George W. Bush might have been, or no, it was H.W. Bush might have used it and it was called out on it. It sounds British because they say things like vitamin and some other words like that, but it's not. Obama said divisive. I heard it on NPR, I think yesterday, divisive.
Hmm.
It kind of has for me a nails on chalkboard kind of sound to it, just because it's not a real thing. It's not even a real Britishism. Another one that's a faux Britishism that is almost universal. The New York Times and the Associated Press are still Chicago Manual style are still holding out, but spelling the word advisor. Um,
Mhm.
it's always been Adviser, because advised, and then you put an R in it. But round about 20, 30 years ago, it started to be common to spell it Advisor, which
Mhm.
sounds fancier, perhaps more British. Advisor. I'm in your advisor. Um, but it's not done that way in British, except now they've adopted a bit the Americanism of spelling it OR.
Huh. There's so much, cross-pollination now with the internet and, do you think that in the long run, British English and American English are just gonna merge and be much more similar than they are today?
No, I don't. I get that in the last chapter a bit. I mean, I think it certainly is the case. The word cross pollination is a good one. That in recent decades there has been more travel both ways than previously. But I started out by talking about reading the British press and encountering all the words. Um, the considerable majority of them haven't crossed over. And similarly, the majority of the Americanisms haven't crossed over. So um, it's not going to become the same, or at least not for a really long time. I don't think, not in our lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're gonna wrap up the main segment right now. So this is we've been talking with Ben Yagoda about his new book, Gobsmacked! Exclamation point. I love that exclamation point. And Ben, where can people find you?
They could find me at my website, benyagoda.com, and also at my blog on Britishisms, which is not one off Britishisms, all one word, not one off Britishisms.com. And
Wonderful.
they can listen to my podcast, The Lives They're Living, which is on Apple and Spotify and all the other platforms.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.